war is waging on in Israel. Let's cross over live now to Tel Aviv for the latest in the conflict in Israel and the Gaza Strip, where we can speak to our correspondent on the ground, Nathan Jeffay. Nathan, a very good afternoon to you. Tell us, first of all, what things are like today in Tel Aviv and how everybody's feeling.
Yeah, I mean, the mood is very sombre. Israel is a very close-knit country where basically everybody knows somebody who has been called up to the army, their spouse been called up to the army, has been affected, has lost a family member, has had a family member who was somehow terrorized by the militants who crossed over. So it's really, really shaken the country. And the mood is just very, very serious. Everybody keeping their children close to them, everybody looking over their shoulders and being on high alert. When all of this started, I was somewhere where the police simply came around and said, somebody needs to stand on the gate and look out for anybody who's coming around on a motorbike. People are on the loose. This is very serious.
Is there any thought that some of the extremists and some of the terrorists might still be actually in Israel?
Yeah, that is always a concern. We've not had kind of an all clear saying, you know, the threat of people inside the country has been lifted. And also there are constant rocket alarms. I was on a Zoom meeting earlier. People were talking and mid-sentence just had to dive off the meeting because the sirens were going and they had, you know, a couple of dozens of seconds to get into the bomb shelter. So yes, both concern of people still being in the country and also concern of rockets kind of shaking us at any moment.
I mean, from this perspective in London, obviously it's a very easy thing to do to wonder what life must be like in Israel, but parts of Israel are under rocket attack practically all the time, aren't they? I mean, I know the Hamas would probably say that it's only very small parts, but they never really stop these rockets, do they?
Well, I mean, it is periodic. There are kind of weeks or months of calm, but they can kind of come back and just simply shake life at any moment. I actually arrived here in Israel from the UK in 2007 and can tell you that at that time, when I arrived, those rockets were able to come a pretty short distance over the border. Now they can very easily reach Tel Aviv, reach Jerusalem, reach theoretically Ben Gurion Airport. So yeah, I mean, these rockets, they're not coming over all the time, but they're constantly on people's minds. They're constantly a threat that comes and goes kind of at the click of a fingers.
Right. And I mean, it's been called Israel's 9/11, understandably, because of the number of people who have died and the number of injuries. But is the thought from the people similar to the thought from the government that this is now time to literally draw a line in the sand and to punish Hamas so much that it never happens again?
Well, a line in the sand is a difficult thing to talk about when it comes to Gaza, because there's the question of what would be a better scenario with Gaza. Hamas is a nightmare. Indeed, it is a nightmare. We've seen what it's capable of. A power vacuum with nobody in charge in Gaza is also a nightmare, as is the prospect, and most people don't want it, of Israel in direct control of Gaza. So yes, I think what we will see is Israel very heavily hitting the terror infrastructure of Hamas. Whether they will actually bring down or want to bring down the Hamas regime, that's a very difficult question.
And what do you make of what you might have seen, I don't know whether you have seen, around the world, some very, what I would regard as ludicrous reactions from groups of people who are sympathetic to the Palestinians' cause, cheering. There are some migrant camps in Greece. There are some marches going on in New York City, in London, in Birmingham, in Manchester, in other parts of Europe. Barcelona, I think, had one as well. People who are obviously originally from perhaps the Middle East cheering Hamas on. I find it extraordinary.
Well, yeah, I think there's kind of, you know, this attempt to frame them somehow as, you know, the underdog who are taking actions that are understandable. But at the end of the day, you know, this is a country with people living, with families living. And what we've had is, you know, basically a terrorist rampage. And the amount of ethical acrobatics that is required to somehow make sense of that and to somehow say that that's acceptable, I think is very much an indictment on the people who go with that thought process.
Yeah. And what about the BBC? I mean, they've come under fire as well because they've continued to call Hamas militants rather than terrorists. And I don't think there's any doubt, given what they've done and given what we've seen them doing, that they are terrorists. That's what we call them.
Yeah, I mean, I think language is very, very volatile in this conflict. You know, we have this, every choice of language tells a story. Every number tells a story. You know, there have been those who in the past, when it's come to a suicide bombing, has included the suicide bomber themselves in the number of people killed. So kind of the need for journalistic integrity in these times is very, just kind of a very high priority, as is the way that we tell the stories. You know, when we see the numbers can be shocking, how many people are being affected in Gaza, how many people are being infected in Israel. But it's not a matter just of numbers. It's a matter of how the authorities are leading their people. You know, obviously the number of casualties and people affected in Gaza is always going to be high when Hamas is intentionally shooting rockets and harboring terrorists within that civilian infrastructure, within civilian Gaza. So I think we need to be very careful how we speak about this conflict and how we report on it.
Yes. And what about the hostages? Because obviously we're led to believe there could be as many as 100, maybe more, Israeli hostages who were taken back to Gaza, many of them families, many of them elderly people, some of them children. Do you know if there's an ongoing conversation going on between Hamas and the Israeli government on that?
We don't know any details of that at the moment. In the past, Israel has fought very hard to bring back anybody who has been in Gaza. Several years ago, I spent some time, I interviewed the father of Gilad Shalit, who was an Israeli soldier who was held in Gaza. In the end, a deal was struck for more than 1,000 Palestinian security prisoners to be released in return for this one soldier. So we don't know anything about what the conversation is, if any conversation going on between Israel and Hamas at the moment. Hamas will obviously be hoping for this enormous price to free some or all of the Israelis who are being held. But Israel is not rushing to make any such deal because it could be seen as playing into the hands of terrorists. So many Israeli families are left with this heart-wrenching situation of their loved ones being in Gaza and really having no information on when or how they may return home.